Hello and welcome back to The Productive Writer. This is episode 4. Sorry I've been gone for a couple of weeks, but I've been quite busy. I've gotten a few new freelance contracts, so I've been on lockdown. This is day 40-something of lockdown now, and I need a haircut. In fact, the whole country needs a haircut, but we're not going to get one for a while. So I've been busy, despite the coronavirus and despite the looming recession that unfortunately is going to affect all of us. There's been a lot of writing work out there, and my upcoming video is going to be about that. But today, I'm going to talk about what you need to do the most in order to prepare for the amount of writing that is going to be available in the upcoming months. And that is increasing your word count and maintaining a high word count. Now, the name of the game in this business, if you want to make a living at this business, is productivity. Because you get paid per book, or as a freelancer, you're often paid per word or per article. And so you need to write as much saleable prose or poetry as you can in order to make a living. The more you write and the more you sell, the more money you make. And the more you're able to write, because then you can have a nice padded bit of a savings and you don't have to worry about a day job and all of that. Now, personally, I write about 20,000 words a week. Since the coronavirus hit and I've lost all my social life, it's been about 24,000. And I have been doing that doing the 20,000 words for the last couple of years. And before then, I worked my way up. I started at 0, like everybody starts, and then got up to 5,000 words a week, and then 10,000 words a week, etc., and worked my way up. And one of the things I did to help myself was I researched the most productive writers in history. I looked at various writers, and I even wrote a book about it called The Writing Secrets of the World's Most Prolific Authors, where I looked at a dozen authors from the 20th century. I looked at writers who had passed on so that I could look at their careers as a whole. And one of the things the cutoff point for these writers is that they had to have written at least 300 novels in their lifetime. So these were writers like Isaac Asimov and Barbara Cartland and Max Brand and John Creasy and a lot of different writers who did very well financially. And they did this by being very prolific. And I looked at their habits, and I've started to imitate their habits. And now I can write 1 million words a year. Luckily, I get to do that on a laptop. Most of these folks did it on manual typewriters, which really amazes me. I don't know how these people had fingers left by the end of their lives. So we're going to talk about some of their techniques today. And we're going to do a bit of exercise on incorporating those techniques into our daily practice. And your practice has got to be daily if you want to get up to these sort of word counts. Now, one thing I want to address first off is that there is this myth that if you write a lot, that somehow it is low quality. That is not true. If you look at writers like Isaac Asimov, he was an icon of science fiction. Barbara Cartland, it doesn't matter if you don't like romance, she thrilled hundreds of millions of readers with her romance novels. So obviously she was onto something. They were quality romance novels. And so you can write consistently large amounts of prose that is entertaining and grips the readers and will make them come back for more. And that's what we're going to look at today. Okay, so some of the techniques that these writers used. First off, they wrote every day. That was essential, as I've talked about from the beginning of this series, and I will continue to hammer home against you, is that you have to write every day. You have to write. Another thing they did is that they would fill their time with writing. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to slog through a 16-hour workday. Some writers, like Barbara Cartland or Enid Mary Blyton, who wrote the famous Five and a bunch of other children's books, had a set period of time. They would start at a set period of time and end at a set period of time, but they were very strict about this. They would always make sure they were writing at that time. Now, other writers like Frederick Faust, who is better known as Max Brand, the Western writer, or John Creasy, who is a famous English writer of mysteries, although he's mostly forgotten today, sadly, they would fill their time. One of the best examples of this is Walter Gibson. Walter Gibson was what they called 1 million word a year man back in the old pulp days in the 30s and 40s. And he hammered out 1 million words a year on a manual typewriter. He's most famous for the character The Shadow, but he wrote a lot of newspaper columns. He wrote books on magic, stage magic. He wrote puzzles and brain teasers and all sorts of different mysteries and thrillers and everything you can imagine. Because when you write 1 million words a year, you have room to experiment. What he did, and I find this very good, and I incorporated this into my own practice, is that he worked on several projects at the same time. Now, I've touched on this earlier, but I think it's important to repeat that if you have 3 or 4 projects going at the same time, assuming you don't have a really tight deadline, you really have to push forward on one. By having 3 or 4 projects at the same time, you can move from one to the other. If you're not feeling very fresh on one, if you've been working on a bit too much lately and you need to give it a little think through before moving forward, then go on to something else. Or if you're a bit burnt out on writing mystery fiction, and you can just switch over to history. I do this all the time. For example, this week I have been working, today is a Friday, and so far this week I have been working on a history booklet for a client about ancient Greece. I just finished that. I have been working on a new adult urban fantasy novel for a client, for a ghostwriting client. I've been editing the 4th in my Masked Man of Cairo mystery series, historical mystery series. And I've been working on some short stories for my Toxic World post-apocalyptic setting. So these are, as you can see, these are very different genres, and I'm also dabbling in both fiction and nonfiction. And this really helps me keep fresh. Walter Gibson did this. He had a manual typewriter in every room of his house with a different project in it. And so he always was faced with work, and he would always be able to work a bit on something because he would always have ideas. And he had a couple of extra little tricks he had. And I've incorporated these two to very great success. They really work. One is stop before you've finished. And by what I mean by that is, if you know what the next paragraph is going to be and you've been writing for a while, but you don't know what the next paragraph after that is, stop. Because when you come back to the work the next day, you'll already know what to write. And just having that next sentence or that next paragraph to do, you will get into the flow of writing that much easier. It's like, oh, I know what happens when he opens the door. Tap, 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 tap. Oh, and then this happens. Oh, great. And it really works. It really gets you back into the zone a lot better. And one trick that he often did was he would stop in the middle of a paragraph or stop in the middle of a sentence. He even sometimes stopped in the middle of a hyphenated word. So he would always know what to write next. Another thing that he did was he would fill up the little times in his day. For example, he was still a practicing stage magician while he was writing, and sometimes he'd do a show in the evening, and he'd go out with his friends to have a drink or whatever, and then he'd come home, and he wasn't quite ready to go to bed yet, so he'll just stop in one of his rooms where one of his typewriters was and write out another page or half a page, whatever. Every little bit helps, and I find I do this a lot. One of my readers asked about how I get my 4,000 words a day done. And she was doing the math. She said, well, if I do 20,000 words a week, then it must be 4,000 words a day, 5 days for the week. But I often do some on weekends, so I don't generally do a full 4,000 word day because I do a little bit on Saturday and Sunday. And how I do that is filling in the little spaces in between. If my wife's working on something, she's a professional scientist, so she's also busy. And, oh, my son's doing homework. Okay, well, I can write a couple pages. Oh, he's in the shower. I can write a couple pages. That way, I don't have to shortchange my family, but I'm still getting work done. Because they're off doing something else, well, then I can do something else. You fill those times. And if you start working on that, start looking at the little spaces of time in between your day, you'll find that you have a lot of them that you can fill up. And so before I go on about other techniques for prolific writers, I want you to do an exercise. You're going to stop this video, and you're going to write out on your average day, maybe you have to divide it between weekdays and weekends, your average day, some of the spare time you might have. Maybe you take the bus to work or the metro, or maybe when your kid comes home from school and he clumps off to do some homework and take a shower, and you've done all the cooking and you generally have a spare half hour. Well, that's a half hour. Write out that time. And then come back and we'll continue. But there's a second part of assignment, and this is a bit of homework. Once you've done that, and you come back and we've done the rest of the video, then for the following week, write out, note anytime you have some spare time. Try to write in those times. If you can't make it for every spare bit of the day to write, then that's understandable. But write down those times and add them up. add up the times. Oh, there was 12 minutes here. Oh, there was 30 minutes here. And add them up for the week and see how much spare time you got. Probably have a lot. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video and write out what you think is the average amount of time that you have. What little spare bits of time do you have during the day? And I'll see you back here in a minute. Okay, I hope that was interesting. And don't forget the homework assignment. Yeah, I always make you right. Which is that I want you to note in an actual day that you're going through extra bits of time that you find. You'll probably find more than you just wrote down. You'll probably find that you actually have more spare time than you thought. Okay, other techniques that very prolific writers have used. One of them, Barbara Cartland, was a hugely prolific writer. She wrote more than 700 novels, mostly romance, and she was a British writer, hugely popular. She was the grandmother-in-law of Lady Diana, and she made millions. And she wrote more than 700 novels, and they're still in print today, and she did very well. She dictated. She had a secretary that she could dictate to. Now, obviously, we can't all afford secretaries. I can't, you can't, but most of you probably can't anyway. I certainly can't. But we have recording materials now that we can use. And there are a lot of famous writers who swear by dictation. I don't use dictation personally, but I know several writers who do. And several very famous writers, like Kevin J. Anderson, the science fiction author, swears by dictation. He always talks about how it's very productive for him. So it's something to try. Now, one thing that prolific writers often do is write what they know. Now, for example, Barbara Cartland was very much into society circles. She was always having dinner with the Marquis or the Baronet, and she wrote about society, and she also researched a lot of historical eras for her romance, and so she knew that period well, and she constantly read about it, and so she set most of her romance novels in those periods. Same with the Western writers, who are some of the most prolific writers out there. Chet Cunningham, who wrote, I think, 350 novels. He is steeped in the lore of the Old West, and I've never visited him, but I'm sure Chet's got an amazing library of Western history books. And he's just comfortable in that space, and so it's that much easier for him to write. Now, I'm not saying be a one-trick pony, because that's generally a bad idea in your career, but the more you can know about a subject, the more you can write. Now, John Creasy, who was a very famous detective novelist in England back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, he set all of his detective work in the contemporary time for his time. So he didn't have to research anything that way. He researched detective methods and police work and that sort of thing, but he didn't have to research anything to do with setting, because most of his mysteries took place in London or some smaller English town like he was familiar with. And he would even cheat a bit. He had a character who was a police detective who was based on a cop that lived next door to him. And he made him an inspector instead of a regular beat officer. But he used the guy's sons as models for his character's sons. And in fact, he even used their names and their hobbies and how well awards they won in school and fights they got into. So he basically stole these guys' lives to put in his novels. And apparently he had consent for this, but I wouldn't, in our litigious society, suggest doing that. But you can certainly pluck from here and there knowledge that you have, characters you've met, people you've met on the street. I do this a lot with my own writing, because I do a lot of writing in setting. I write a lot of books set in North Africa, and I spend a lot of time in North Africa. For example, in my book, The Last Hotel Room, which is set in contemporary Tangier, a lot of the minor characters are people I've met. A lot of, when the camera pans across a scene, that is me a few years ago, sitting in a cafe in Tangier looking around me. And it gives a really nice verisimilitude to the work, and it makes it easier to write. It makes it quicker to write. Nothing so inspiring as sitting in a cafe in North Africa to get your word count up. So, brief recap, since this is already getting to be a bit long. I might do a second parter if there's enough interest. Write what you know. Fill the spaces in your time as much as possible. Try to write every day, or definitely write every day. Attempt dictation. Dictation might work. if you want. It's not required. And multiple projects. That's a big one for me. That's definitely worked for me. So I hope this has been useful. Hit the subscribe button. If you want a part 2 on this, I have a lot more material on this because I wrote a whole book about it. And the link for that is in the description. Then put a comment in the comments section. And hope you do the homework assignment because it really will help. Look through your average day. Keep a notebook with you and note down spare moments in time that you have. And you'll find that it adds up. And you need to just start training yourself to work in those times. Like, oh, I have 15 minutes. The kid's in the shower. Okay, bam, I'm going to get a page done. Because remember when we did that exercise to write a page? It probably didn't take more than 20 minutes. It probably took 15 or maybe even 10. So, do that. Give it a shot. And I will see you here in a few days for episode 5. Keep on writing.